After 12 years of developing several studios, 2 games, and a game engine simultaneously, the job becomes a bit of a game itself, and Star Citizen is playing out in a big way right in front of us. 2024 has been a year of shift. From player expectations to company priorities, the year has seen a lot of discussion surrounding the direction of the game and the progression of its development. We've seen restructuring, rescheduling, and painful departures. But I think we are seeing the effects of CIG as a company shifting as a whole in line with the game and overall project they're heralding. And at the forefront of that shift is senior game director of both Squadron 42 and Star Citizen, Richard Tyrer. Here's a story of how a slowly building shift in CIG was made clear in 2024. This video is all speculation in my own opinion. It's based on my own research, but I don't know everything that's going on and could have missed a few things. It's a bit of a video essay of sorts, so take it all with a grain of salt. Get comfortable though, cause this is a long one. So thank you for coming to my Tomato Talk. Star Citizen for a very long time has been about the tech. The company operated quite a bit like a tech company, from the particular sprints and deliverables they focused on, the way they went about delivering them, and the underlying philosophy of the studios. Creating an entire game engine was the company's major focus basically up until this last year. From object container streaming to server meshing, developing their own version of upscaling, creating an in-house ray tracing solution, volumetric clouds, 64-bit supported full global maps, and on and on. And Star Citizen was the funding model for this tech-focused expansion. Because of this, features were released a bit haphazardly, surely for an alpha experience. Get the feature in, make sure it works with the general engine environment, and then move on. This happened with almost every feature, but we've seen it most clearly with ship naming, docking, and up until recently the star map. This meant the deliverables we received were often exciting but incongruent. It didn't feel like there was much direction to the feature drops in the 3.x era like you would see in normal games that would have themes in every update. And that's because there weren't. They were just building an engine and servicing the PU while they worked on Squadron 42. And for much of that time, we heard a lot about how the game was going to work, from the quantum simulation to the Planet Tech demo, to planet-side stealth missions. We saw and heard about a lot of the systems that would turn the gears and make these mechanics work for us. But because so much of Star Citizen's gameplay was meant to be based on these systems, less effort was put into the packaged portions of the game, like bunkers and smaller scale missions that were built on a system kind of like that star map I mentioned, so not really going anywhere. So in the end, players were left with systems that weren't complete and small pieces of packaged gameplay that didn't satisfy. At the time, Todd Papy was leading most of this effort, and he would often be right there with the community explaining how these systems would function and drive the game forward. He held up a lot of the communication and understanding of how the PU was working and would work in the future based on what they were developing. I mean, this guy would be here at almost every single patch in Star Citizen Live explaining decisions and future plans to the community. He seemed to really understand what was going on and where things were going based on what we had heard from Chris Roberts and Tony Zurovic in the previous years. And one of my favorites, here he is talking about the danger of Star Citizen on a per-system basis, something I think is really relevant right now.
Stanton is a somewhat lawful system. It's got UEE versus Pyro is supposed to be a very unlawful system, where players want to be able to find the PvP versus where players don't want to find it. You know, what system should I be in? What system, do I want to go to? And
if I'm in Terra, I probably should feel pretty safe. If I'm in Pyro, right, I should be looking over my shoulder.
Exactly, okay. Exactly.
But while he was leading the persistent universe and building up something special, CIG itself was also growing as a company. Other parts of the company were making progress on key points and pushing initiatives forward. And this guy here was very quickly making a difference in the company. I mean, here he is on stage at CitizenCon with Chris and Todd presenting the first jump point the same year that he was hired. Richard was more of a traditionalist in game dev, but I don't think he was brought on for that reason. At least the first time I saw him show up to talk development in Star Citizen, he was the FPS systems designer.
Hey guys, so I'm Richard Tyra. I'm the lead FPS systems designer, and basically I do everything related to the character. So anything to do with weapons, actor gameplay, anything that Sean just described is under my umbrella.
So I imagine you've done a lot of work recently on Star Marine, and that's why we're here today.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep, Star Marine, Arena Commander.
I do think, though, as we'll talk about in the next few minutes, that successes there took him beyond that role pretty quickly. If we jump forward from 2019 to 2021, a year after they had said Pyro would release, development was going through a restructuring of sorts, not unlike now. Focus was doubling down on Squadron 42, because that was the real game on a deadline, and so teams were being shifted and consolidated to further that. We saw this in the announcements, the roadmap that was being developed at the time, and other bits that were scattered throughout in the news cycle. But there was something else going on. At this point in time, Richard Tyra was brought on to Star Citizen Live to talk to Jared about these changes that were going on and explain why they were being made. Rich at the time laid out a major problem CIG believed that they had identified that was slowing down the development of both Squadron 42 and Star Citizen.
Recently, we recognized we identified a need for a change with Squadron 42, with the way that we've been developing Squadron 42.
The biggest thing is kind of how I discussed there. You have the feature team and you have the content teams. The biggest thing is that we wanted to create a closer relationship between the feature teams and the level designers, who are basically the people who are using. They're essentially the client who are utilizing these features, which is usually a traditional pipeline. It's just something that the way the pillars are set up, it kind of creates this two-step process. So that's where kind of I came in to kind of come over, because what would happen is we'd go, okay, this is a feature that we want to introduce, like trolley push pull or whatever, or any of the weapons or armor or any of the other mechanics we want. And then there'll be a step of teaching that to the level designers and what they need to do. But now they're going to be part of that process, which is a more traditional way of doing it. And so what we do is we're going to start doing that process. So we're going to start implementing these features, but it will hopefully they'll be more proven and more executed because we've already implemented them into actual real gameplay scenarios, rather than like test maps or testing out theories and so on and so forth.
He wanted to bring the feature-focused devs and the content-focused devs using those features closer together. Now, this was 2021, specifically focused on Squadron 42, but it does sound quite similar to the goals of Star Citizen recently, shifting more and more of the company back into offices, specifically all in a more central location in Manchester. These kinds of moves are focused on efficiency of cost, but more importantly, communication and the development that can take place in closer-knit, physically connected groups, just as we'll hear Rich describe later on regarding the game now. You'll notice, though, that he said something kind of key there. Listen to this.
But if you were working as a traditional game development, which is like not as a live product, you would make it in that manner, and you would play it yourself to get an idea of, is this right? Does it feel good? And then work towards it. The way it kind of works right now is that we would deliver it before the content teams will have access to it, and then they'll put a wrapper around it. But that's kind of how it's previously worked. To be honest, it's kind of unique in game development. It's not something that happens everywhere. I mean, it's something that's definitely new. I've only ever seen at Cloud Imperium, but it's the nature of how we're developing all of these different projects.
The problem they identified, at least according to Rich at the time, was due to the development style and the way features were being delivered. As he took over the core gameplay segment of gameplay, that being things that have to do with the player character, we saw the fruits of his and his team's labor over the last year, and then some. FPS reload changes, EVA updates, multi-tool updates, UI updates, mapping system, and FPS scanning, which we still don't have, but also Squadron 42 in general. Because not long after this, we learned Rich had actually taken over quite a bit of the development of the entire game. Where in 2021 he was the Squadron 42 FPS game director, in 2022 when he showed up to present alongside the founder and CEO Chris Roberts at CitizenCon, he was game director.
Mr. Richard Tyra.
Hello, how's it going?
While his work impacted Star Citizen, he seemingly had quickly become a major part of getting Squadron 42 put together entirely. About 17 months later, he introduced himself on Star Citizen Live and essentially laid it all out.
So I am Richard Tyra,
and I am the Senior Game Director for Star Citizen and Squadron 42. And that means I work directly with Chris on the vision for both games, and then I work directly with the teams on executing that vision.
So, like what it sounded like he was aiming to do with Squadron 42 back in 2021, which was translating the vision that Chris had into more traditional development for the sake of shipping content and making progress, he was now explaining that he'd be doing just that for both Squadron 42 and Star Citizen going forward. Something that sounds a little bit similar to a letter we may have gotten recently. Now, to be clear, what he said back in 2021 was mainly to make teams more efficient. It wasn't necessarily to get rid of systemic features. He actually explained that he likes systemic features and believes that they have a place in Star Citizen versus the more tailor-made gameplay you'd see in something like Squadron 42 back in 2021. But I do still think we're looking at a less systemic future in Star Citizen as well. Regardless, when asked about how he was keeping both games running in this conversation, he mainly focused on the efficiency and connectivity of the teams under him.
I've set up hierarchies on both of those teams to be able to work independently of me when I'm not there.
Then later in that same interview, he again spoke on his most important goal for the game going forward, and honestly note the distinct difference in how he's addressing the game now versus back in 2019.
When I look at Star Citizen itself, it's a concatenation of a lot of features and a lot of content. I want it to be a cohesive experience that is all tied together, and I want to get there as soon as possible. I want somebody to be able to play the game and understand all the things that they have available to them, and I want that to be a good onboarding experience, and then to have thousands of hours of gameplay and content for people to be able to play. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a lot of gameplay already in the game, but it's in isolated pockets. It's like if you want to just be a miner, great, you can go and do mining, you can do that loop, but I want the connections, I want the interwebbing. That's the difference between features and content and a game. And I want to push towards that as quickly as possible.
So it's no surprise then to see him be the one laying out the plan for Star Citizen 1.0 at CitizenCon 2024, or to be the one playing Squadron 42 on stage presenting the big demo after all these years. I'm not saying Chris isn't still the visionary founder and CEO behind Star Citizen. He's the one presenting, he's the one sending us the letters, he's the one running the companies. But Rich does seem to have been given more and more ability to carry out that vision and translate it into content however it needs to be done. At the same time, it also seems that the general culture and philosophy in the company around picking and choosing features and tech to develop without a clear and consistent long-term path on the gameplay side has dissipated a bit. As more of the team has centralized around the same roof for communication, a clear and necessary path has been laid out for what Star Citizen is supposed to be, an actual concept for what players can expect, a target to aim for, and a goal to hold them accountable to. This reorganization of the company we've seen can hopefully mean 2024 is the beginning of a less meandering development path for Star Citizen 1.0, even if that means one that is not as ambitious. We also see a continued drive for more efficient development, a model that calls for more content along with the features being developed, rather than just the features in a place to test them. All this being laid out in the letter from the chairman just last week sounds a bit like the reasoning behind the Squadron 42 team restructuring a few years ago. It may be that something very similar is happening at this very moment or over the last year when regarding Star Citizen, something to take note and keep an eye out for. But this timing, again, is not to say that any one person is responsible for this change at the company. Todd Pappy was a great director who presented clearly, cut to the point, and was loved by the community. He, unfortunately, I believe, did not have the resources he needed to carry out what Chris wanted to do with Star Citizen given the state the engine was in, and thus, the PU never got to move forward based on the ideals that were being set out for it. Now, I think that we have reached a point where they can start to do that, but now they've consolidated so much, and as has been reported, Todd Pappy has left the company based on family needs and wanting to stay in America rather than move over to Manchester. And while I don't believe his departure has anything to do with his performance or the performance of Star Citizen overall, I do think over time it'll get wrapped up in this part of the story, but for the record, I don't think it has anything to do with this. But like even in the letter from the chairman of Chris detailing this shift that they're making in early 2024 to the public, these two announcements were made on the same page. so that doesn't help. Anyway, Star Citizen at the end of 2024 is in a better place than it was at the beginning, and that's not because of any single person, but the efforts of hundreds of employees and the decisions behind the scenes to maybe make some important shifts for the better future. That is the story of the game and company overall, but how did the gameplay actually change this year? To be honest, the game we were playing a year ago wasn't really that different on the outside, but the actual way we were playing it has changed quite a bit for better and for worse depending on who you are. A year ago we had no crash recovery. The significance of that varies depending on who you are, but when you spend 15 to 45 minutes getting ready for a fun session of gaming and the whole system crashes forcing you to start over, that can ruin a whole night, even more so when you're in a big group. Being able to sacrifice a couple of minutes to just sit there and continue where you left off is a blessing when it works. Now with server meshing, some parts of the star system may crash, but others will still be running. I've actually experienced this already, so it's even more robust now. A year ago, we were also only just starting to carry things with physical SCU boxes. While it wasn't the only way to do things at the time, by 3.24 later in the year, everybody was getting used to packing items into boxes to physically move them around. While there are still some problems with this system and I can describe the whole change in just a couple of sentences, it's pretty significant for a game that hadn't done much more than drag and drop inventory for a whole 10 years before that. Like, that's a long time to get really used to how a game works before flipping it on its head. Suddenly you have to consider the cargo hold for your ship, its own shape, whether it's on the exterior or split between two different places on the ship, whether it's capable of quick loading and unloading of cargo. Organizations are now hiring requisitions officers and creating supply caches. And when I say organizations, I do also mean our own here at GII. Best of all though, this really did completely change the way things could be interacted with. You can now gather up all your loot into a box and sell it at a station, and you can see how this would develop in the future. From shipping commodities between two bases being built, to packing up and stealing other people's goods from their derelict ship. There's a whole huge range of gameplay that's unlocked by the physicalization of cargo and the items that interact with it. Best of all though, this change along with cargo missions and just recently the economy rebalance have revitalized a part of the game that has been left largely dormant for more than half a decade: cargo hauling. This profession is the most important in the game to get everything churning, so it's good they got it up and running this year. And that can't be mentioned without giving some time to the tracked beam changes we also saw. Something the community was seriously discussing all the way back when they were first teasing the devices with Auroras and people were convinced they were going to be overpowered. Now that we are finally past the cargo refactor, many would probably say that they are actually underpowered. This year, the weight and presence of items started to matter. Tractor beams have been volume limited so they can only carry certain boxes for certain tool sizes. New tools have been introduced to allow for more diversified methods of moving boxes and completing the jobs in your profession. And ships have started to be affected in their flight by the mass of cargo placed on board them. The changes are due to continue in this area and get quite deep for the cargo haulers who want that really in-depth profession and experience, but there's no denying that they have already seen it quite nice this year. And say what you will about Star Citizen FPS gameplay, I wholly believe it took a much needed step up this year. Not to become an industry standard by any means, it's still got plenty of ways to go, but to focus on the experience around one of the most common activities in the game: FPS gameplay. Interacting with the world, running combat missions, which are the majority of what's on offer so far, moving around in space, navigating the game, picking up items, and controlling our ship all took a step up this year. Say what you will about inventory management, the one place it makes sense to have quick access is with ammo, and backpack reloading is a nice compromise, making it easier to flow smoothly through combat without too great a penalty. Not a big deal, but something that definitely makes FPS much smoother, and combined with other changes, adds up quickly. I know plenty of people don't like the looting screen, but to me this felt like the first time we could actually easily loot on the go and just pick up the quick things like ammo or med pens. We still need better functionality for inventory access like that, but I think this was a big part of making Star Citizen FPS more palatable and a good starting point for the screen itself. Add to that the updated interaction system, which I think made things a bit better, but mostly allowed me to set a favorite action to my F prompt for specific items. Now, whenever I come across a fuse in Pyro, the default action is to store it in my backpack rather than to pick it up in my hand. This kind of quality of life feature was very, very few and far between before this year, and these are just the kinds of things that really make the game easier for me to play. Same with the maps. The minimap is a valued addition. Long ago, I didn't really want one, and I still think there's a lot of room to make people download and find valuable data for these maps, but it looks like that's the direction they're headed in. And the map system they've brought in has proven useful while navigating caves, ships, and space stations. Being able to see active players in real time and where they are is very cool, and it's allowed for better coordination for groups than we've had before. And while we're at it, the UI in general has finally started to hit release candidate worthy this year, I think. That's not to say again that it's the best out there, it still needs some polish and better functionality, but looking at the star map, the engineering UI, the new HUD, the MFDs, these are all interfaces a game could release with. Before, everything felt very placeholder. Even the newer UIs they were putting in over the last 4 or 5 years didn't really feel like they took a lot of design cues into account or followed practices you'd see as industry standards. You can still see it now with things like the comm screen or most any MobiGlap assets for that matter. So even though the map still has some very annoying usage quirks and the ship HUD can get a bit noisy, 2024 marked a significant shift in their delivery of UI and the support behind it. Can't wait to see what's coming in the department next year. Speaking of UI, the advanced HUD that launched at the end of the year is just what about every hardcore flyer was wanting. And better yet, it's an option based on what mode you're in, nav or SCM mode. And it can be toggled by the MFDs, giving you so much more customization over your ship HUD based on what ship you're in. And I don't really want to get into master modes, but that was also a big change this year now. Master modes is being tweaked as we go forward, but there's no denying that the flight model took a huge shift this year in making sure speeds are slower. And I don't think that will ever change no matter what happens in the future. So there was certainly a big shift in how people can expect to go forward in combat in Star Citizen this year, and that's all I'm saying about master modes in this video. Back to that MFD update and customization as a whole, that was also a really good part of UI, from the power management interface to the player selectable layouts and saved profiles to castable displays on your helmet, and finally the unique styles per manufacturer. Overall, just again, another big pickup in UI. And the most important change this year is the beginning of optimization in game dev, and a shift away from the engine focus. I love the development of this game. It's what this channel was really built off of, just covering all of the interesting bits. But I want to play. I want to show you guys gameplay and cover guides and make tutorials and talk about base building and best practices and who's at war with who. We can still cover the development, of course, but it's nice to see such a shift in almost every avenue of communication that they're headed towards more focus on a game environment. Even if that does mean it'll make it tougher to get to Star Citizen 1.0. But it really started in earnest this year. The Gen 12 renderer started to allow small performance gains for players. DLSS, FSR, and TSR all also helped in that department. Light improvements and cloud optimizations helped in the graphics side, with new GPU practices and more options in the graphics department made visible to players. We can now track our frames in the server and on the client. We can see how many players are on our shard and in our server, which shard we're even on, how our own frame generation is going, and what our general stats are. Server meshing is now in the game, raising the average server tick rate, the player cap, and restrictions on other important things, one of which is the mission system and the number of star systems that are in the game, which do demarcate specific lines of law and order. With 4.0, we saw the launch of the mission Refactor, a refactor on a system that was launched all the way back in 3.0, 7 years ago. This system was outdated, dilapidated, and slow. It left many missions unfinished and kept the studio from bringing more into the game quickly. With server meshing, they've finally been able to get it into a position that allows for better dynamic risk-based reward calculations, so we're seeing better payouts, the ability for missions to persist even if you have crashed or logged out of the game, and less failed missions due to the game having problems. Not to mention, we have a multitude of missions that they've talked about and worked on already that haven't been brought in, I believe, because of this refactor. I'm talking about mining missions, talked about in 2022, the barge heist mission, talked about in 2023, a refactor to the various narrative-based mission giver quests that we have to do, ship escort missions that showed up in monthly reports over the years, and investigation missions from CitizenCon 2021. There's a lot of content that maybe has to be refactored a bit, but we can at least see has been held back for some reason, and I think this was it. While 4.0 has launched pretty unstable, and with the built-in caveat that you'll probably want another version of the game to play in 3.24.3, it did cap off a year of wide-ranging optimization options to the game. And that's what 2024 felt like. When you boil it down to the change, this really felt like the year Star Citizen started its shift towards finally becoming a game. I know I keep saying it, but that's my point. That Star Engine trailer felt like an announcement of sorts for an investment matured and maybe ready to produce. And from the moves being made, the people making these moves, and the newer speed it's being done, CIG seems to want to be able to do that as well. Now, I want to be very clear here to everybody who has taken the time to watch this far into the video. First of all, thank you. Second, I'm not saying Rich is the cause of this shift we're seeing, but I do think he's a very visible part of it, and clearly is also a bit of a herald based on what he said. But even by his own admission, this is a company-focused move more towards cohesive delivery rather than just work. Delivering content filled with features rather than just features made for content down the line. And that is the final major bit of change 2024 seems to have ushered in, at least that I'm covering here today. The same content-focused sentiment that we talked about throughout this video has been reflected by Chris Roberts after the major goal of server meshing has been achieved on live servers. At the end of 2024, to finish up the year, Chris Roberts laid out a plan for better content delivery, stability, and playability in the name of player enjoyment, and likely active player numbers. They see the need to keep players happy and playing, and luckily for them, the moves have been in play for quite a while, it seems. Maybe it was planned, maybe it's making the best of a rough situation. Whatever it is, it's clear that 2024 is the beginning of a new phase for Star Citizen, a drive towards full content delivery and versioning, towards actually becoming a game, but possibly at the cost, at least early on, of more interesting systemic design choices. And it also may possibly slow down the development of Star Citizen overall, at least until all of the features have been made to function together. Either way, I think many will be happy to see a more playable experience coming together as long as the key aspects of the game and the design are left in place. It just depends on what you think those key aspects are. But what do you think of this major shift I think we saw for Star Citizen this year? Was the year itself a success in terms of content delivered or direction taken? Are you feeling better or worse about this year than last? I'm waiting to see what comes of this. There's a lot of ways this could go. I do think what we've been seeing is productive in getting Star Citizen produced though. And it's clearly a big moment for the company that's been building for a little while, hopefully to get them where they want to be. So while 2025 is more unclear than any year before it, I think, I'm looking forward to what happens. And I'll give you a look at an interesting poll I've been running lately here on the channel monthly. I've been asking you all how you feel about the game at the time, and barring a slight inconsistency on one answer in the first month, it looks like positivity has risen over the last few months. But that's to be expected with 4.0 coming out. Let's see how things go in the new year. And let me know what you think. Thank you so much for spending your year following Star Citizen's development with me, and for watching this video all the way through. Holy crap. We have a lot more plans for the new year. On the stream, here on this channel, with shorter form content, the podcast over on the second channel, our new gameplay channel, and our new personal channel, The Tomatoes. Hopefully next year can give us even more to argue about, and I'll see you here for it. Thank you again for watching this video all the way through though. I know it was a long one. I hope you learned something new in it. Merry Christmas, and I'll see you in the next.